This is the predominant workforce, but they're immigrant, and a lot of these AFL unions were very exclusive with that regard. They would not organize immigrant workers. They were not interested in the in the unskilled production workers, and many of them were whites only, reflecting the predominant white supremacy that characterized every level of society, from management throughout the working class as well. Not entirely, there were dissenting voices. But this is important. 1924, the reason I draw attention to this is that Detroit, basically a majority of the voters, voted for the Ku Klux Klan candidate for mayor. His name was Chester Bowles, B-O-W-L-E-S. I stress that because it was a write-in campaign endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, and unfortunately for Chester, most people misspelled his name. Not most, but many. They left out the E. That's the only reason he did not take office. 17,000 votes were disallowed because they had misspelled it. I want to stress this because Detroit in 1924 was the most anti-union city in North America. And it came within a whisker of electing a Ku Klux Klan candidate for mayor. Again, I want to break that mold of a presumption of the inevitability of Detroit's status as a union town, for that matter, or that organizing in the 1930s was an automatic given, inevitable, given the suffering of the Great Depression. Most unions at the time of 1932, when George Barnett was speaking, were whites only, men only, excluded women, often rejected immigrant workers, and were only interested primarily in organizing the most skilled. So it was an exclusive, narrowly based labor movement heading towards the dustbin of history. And for many reasons, I think George Barnett had ample cause to assume that they would not be able to revolutionize themselves. The revolutionary moments at that time were coming from management. Not just the industrial engineering that transformed the building of automobiles and other complex machines, but also social engineering. And what you see here is part of the Ford Sociological Department. In order to get the vaunted $5 day, how many here have heard of the $5 day? Okay. $5 day, by the way, implemented to reduce the turnover, because workers being pushed into this highly mechanized, machine-driven process would not do it for $2.50 a day, which was the prevailing wage. To keep them on the job and reduce the turnover rate of 400%. In other words, to keep 13,000 jobs filled, Ford had to hire 52,000 workers in the first year of that factory. That's what the $5 day was all about. Stay on the job. It's driven work, it's hard, it's brutal, but we'll pay you more money than any other worker on the planet. That's what the $5 day was about. In order to get it, though, you had to allow Ford company inspectors into your home, and they would examine your personal life, your home life, to make sure that it was an appropriate American standard of living. If it wasn't, if you, for example, couldn't produce the sales slip for the furniture, if you bought it on time, that was something that Ford disapproved of. He didn't like banks. He was anti-Semitic. He believed all bankers were Jews. Therefore, he did not want you borrowing money to purchase products, etc., etc. You couldn't have boarders in the home. The wife had to be at home. She could not be working. Did not want two wage earners in the family. The wife had to be basically pigeonholed into that narrowly defined presumption of what the appropriate role for women was all about. If you didn't make muster on any of these things, and in this case, he's showing her how to make the bed. This is the company coming into your house and saying, you do it our way, and you follow a long list of prescribed behavior or you're gone. Now, this was not characteristic. Ford was the more intrusive and negative in terms of this kind of approach. General Motors tended to be more characteristic of what large corporations were doing. It's basically a system of corporate paternalism that represented a carrot. There was no effective labor movement, as I've mentioned. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no Social Security. None of those things existed. The message was that if you are loyal to the company, you will be rewarded with these elements in the 1920s of a private welfare system provided by the company. And you can see what it looks like here. A whole range of benefits that in that day looked very, very positive to people. This was unprecedented, that large corporations with this kind of wealth would distribute it on a limited basis, but an effective distribution to keep people loyal to the company. And if you didn't go for the carrot, there was always the stick. If these two guys look like gangsters, that's because they are. And they were effectively mobilized by most employers in Detroit on behalf of basically strong-arming anyone who stepped out of line and began to organize on behalf of union representation. Keep in mind that until 1940, there was a law on the books in Michigan that made even peaceful picketing illegal. It was deemed to be a threatening gesture on behalf of an implied possibility of violence against anyone who crossed the picket line. So it was a Supreme Court decision here in the state Supreme Court in the 1890s, and there was a federal Supreme Court decision in 1921 that said basically the same thing. In other words, at least according to the judicial interpretation of the law, even peaceful picketing could result in this kind of outcome here. That didn't mean it happened in every strike, but employers always had that weapon when they wanted to seek an injunction, and in the 1920s they sought hundreds and hundreds of injunctions to break unions. So a carrot and the stick, both quite effective, and with the AFL limiting itself in a self-destructive manner to a very narrow base. And just to underline how grim the circumstances were, your employer might very well be an overt supporter of the Nazi Party. In this case, Henry Ford, the best known among them, but the Hearst newspapers as well, Horace Dodge, the Johns Mansville family, openly admiring the work of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini in breaking unions and establishing a top-down regime that obviously would protect the Ford Motor Company in Germany.
Didn't Hitler in Mein Kampf quote Ford? Or
yes. Yeah, he was very much an admirer of Heinrich Ford, because Henry Ford owned a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and in that newspaper he reprinted the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was a fictitious work actually authored by the Tsarist police to defame and attack Jews on the presumption that there was this worldwide conspiracy in the Jewish population to overturn capitalism and so on and so forth. Ford was a believer of that. He reprinted those documents, and his newspaper was basically a mill for anti-Semitic presumptions. And Henry Ford, therefore, when Hitler was interviewed, by the way, in 1924, the reporter goes into his office, and there's a blown-up picture of Henry Ford behind Hitler's desk. And Hitler translated actually Henry Ford's writings into 10 different languages when he seized power in Germany. It gave a respectable patina to anti-Semitism. Now the results of all this, the union busting, the court injunctions, the self-limiting nature of the labor movement at the time, was something very familiar to anyone who's been talking about the one percenters in today's context. This is the top 10%. And it's roughly the same numbers, and we'll come back to this more recent event, but this is what it looked like in 1929, as the labor movement was being driven into the ditch and on the brink of disappearing. That's what George Barnett was referring to, and as employers exercised extraordinary social dominance and a capacity to have their way without a whole lot of effective resistance. Nevertheless, Barnett was wrong. And does this number jump out to anybody who's familiar with the current circumstances of labor?
Pretty close.
What are you're nodding?
Isn't that what it is now?
It is what it is now. It is in private sector. If you add in public sector, where there is, at least for the time being, a higher level of union organization, but we are right back to where we were in 1929, 1930, when, by the way, the public sector was much smaller. And yet Barnett was wrong. In fact, within just a few years of his presumption, again echoed across the spectrum, that the labor movement was headed towards oblivion, within years millions had been organized, and the proportion of the labor force organized had jumped dramatically. It would continue to rise until the early 1950s, when it peaked at about 32–33%. Now we're back down to 7%. But I want to suggest that if we can think through what happened in these years and answer two questions. Why were so many industries organized all at once, unlike, as I said, the piecemeal nature of organizing today, one workplace by another? Why was it back then so likely that you had entire industries, every hotel in Detroit, all of the cigar plants, all of the industrial laundries, all of the auto supplier plants, all of the Chrysler plants, all at once? One question, how did that happen and why? And two, why did it happen in 1936 and 1937 and not 1932 and 1933? The worst years of the Great Depression were 1932 and 1933. If it's suffering that drives people to mobilization, it should have occurred then. 35 and 36 were actually pretty good years in the economy, relative to what had preceded, and relative, by the way, to what would follow. And yet that's when this massive mobilization occurs. Now there's some obvious features of that, but let's let's keep that in mind as we look through what might have contributed to Barnett's failure to grasp what was happening. Now, one obvious reason, and the one that's most often cited, and it's certainly relevant, is the collapse of corporate paternalism. Because General Motors and the rest of them that had provided these kinds of private welfare schemes abandoned them by 33, 34. They're gone. And so the previous payoff for loyalty to the company is now removed. And you have massive unemployment. There is no unemployment benefits. There is no Social Security. There's nothing to protect people. There isn't even anything approximating the obviously porous now social safety net that we have today. That didn't exist back then. So people are thrown basically out in the street, and indeed, this is what the street often looked like. There's a wave of evictions across Detroit, peaking in 1933. And I want to stress this. The crisis that began in the workplace with the unemployment that followed upon the reduction in production, as obviously there's not enough consumer demand